So I guess I will take the honor of the first question, and I'm going to try and stump Michael specifically, as promised. No, I'm kidding. Listen, he's Canadian. The anger he had during performance reviews. When I think of the ultimate goal of a program like this, right, as Michael alluded to around changing labeling standards. So the last time there was a significant shift, I suppose, in this type of arena, circa 2016-ish, when the FDA RDIs were adjusted. It was kind of a mixed bag from this perspective, right? They moved away from IUs, right, for vitamin D and for vitamin E into micrograms and milligrams, but into DFEs, for example, right? And I think that seemed largely to be parroting sort of the Academy's response, right, and the now not super recent DRI updates. So I guess the question is, do you feel that this is something, Ilse or folks could advocate for, given the obvious, I think, heard lots of nods and sort of agreements on the need to assess bioavailability. But is this something that you feel collectively, and this may be speculation, that could move in the absence of adjusting DRIs or having some kind of an Academy position on that National Academy position? Speculate. Like I said, a stumper. No, I mean, everybody can answer.
I didn't know if you were joking or serious.
I was.
Yeah, I actually think they really should. We have that for niacin equivalents. We have for DFE. We have it for vitamin A. We have it for vitamin E. I think that it should be the same thing for iron, for calcium, because of the excellent work that's happening in calcium. And as this ILSI framework gets adopted by others and we have the data, I think it should be done that way. And if applied to food, single foods, and applied to dietary supplements. And then we can further adopt based on meals to the point that you're making. But we can't anticipate what are all the meals and combinations. But let's be clear. I mean, there's already for-profit companies out there personalizing nutrition, using apps, using the database that University of Minnesota is such an excellent database, and they're working so hard to maintain. But it gives the consumer a false sense of security.
Thanks. My question is for Lisa. First up, the presentations were great. What a lot of great talks. For your database that you have, you said you have 178 nutrients or different components in there. So I was wondering, where do you, and you probably said this, but where do you get that data if you're not analyzing it yourself?
Yeah. So our first go-to is looking at the USDA data lab. That would be our first go-to. If we can't find values there, oh, sorry, so I'm going to re-say it since my microphone wasn't working. Our first go-to is the USDA Nutrient Data Laboratory to see if the values are available there from chemical analyses of foods. If it's not available there, we will look in the literature. Sometimes it's published in the scientific literature, nutrient composition values. We'll look at international databases if it's relevant to the foods here in the US. And then we will do, if it's not available in any of those sources, we will rely on imputation. And so imagine say an orange and a tangerine, maybe some specific values available for an orange, but not for tangerines. We might determine that they're close, they're similar enough foods that we can impute the value for the orange to the tangerine. So those combination of things. We do no chemical analysis ourselves. We're entirely dependent on using other sources of information, which we greatly value their accessibility.
This is a question probably again for you, Lisa. A number of years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, ILSI actually helped facilitate a large project with USDA to build a national database of nutritional data from companies. And many US and Canadian food companies got involved, as well as ingredient manufacturers. So I'm just curious, is that still in existence? Have you been able to access and utilize that? Is it still maintained? Is there an opportunity to repeat that again? And I'm just curious where that went.
I can't speak to whether it's being maintained. I know that when you go to Food Data Central, it is still there and it is being maintained. Okay. And it's turned out to be not terribly helpful to us because we want the most up-to-date ingredient statement and nutrition facts panel for creating our food product formulations that we do when we update a food product category. And it's not always the latest and greatest. And so we actually tend to go right to the food manufacturer's website as our first resource.
And that's why I asked. I was wondering, it's only useful if it's maintained. And so that's really what I was asking. It wasn't, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, are you asking about the branded food database? It is definitely still available and being updated all the time. But again, that's just label information.
400,000.
Yeah, I was going to say actually over I think 450,000 foods.
Yeah.
But it's label information, but they're continually looking to update that. And yes, that is still maintained.
Yeah, so I don't want to just dismiss it. It's there and it's being updated. But for our purposes, when we're looking to update a category, even if it's just a year out of date, it's, we want them just the best. And it hasn't been super easy for us to interface with either. So we've been using manufacturers.
Hey, Craig Llewellyn, Exponent. I got two questions, one directed mostly to Connie and Michael, and then one to you, Lisa. The first one is thinking more down the road, away from bioavailability, something I call physiologically available. So thinking about riboflavin and entrance not only into the bloodstream, but also interest into the mitochondria. So we have a lot of functional type products that want to come to the market that are making those types of claims, and oftentimes we need the data to support that. So is that a natural evolution for the future, possibly?
So we developed a framework that could be applicable by any expert for a particular nutrient that would have their different parameters to consider. And whereas we'd like to include the bioconversions and the total physiological utilization, how are you going to measure that? If you take a human and eats a food, what are you going to access to get anything other than absorption? Well, we're not quite there yet. So it comes from preclinical type of work that you can make speculations, but we don't know how to assess conversion very well yet. Maybe metabolomics will get us closer there in the future, so we're hopeful, but I don't think it's shovel ready.
You're right. It just narrows the gap. We're moving in the right direction by getting a better estimate on food labels and into food databases for consumers and scientists to use.
Thanks. And the second part of my question for Lisa is building off what we heard on the last session. I've been doing a lot of work recently around, waste to upcycling, where the nutrient aspect or the anti-nutrient aspect of different parts of plants that weren't commonly consumed is another area of interest that I was wondering how that might be captured as well. So, we thinking about a bell pepper, we consume the seeds, we consume the flesh, we don't consume the stem, but I've had clients who want to bring products to market that use the entire bell pepper. So just how do we do that? What does that take? Probably more data, right?
More data, more chemical analyses of that new, food ingredient is what's needed. And, maybe sometimes we could make an assumption that it probably is the same nutrient profile as the rest of the flesh or, whatnot, but other times it's probably not. And we really need chemical analyses. When we see the ingredient statement and a novel ingredient, it's a struggle for us if we can't find chemical analysis data on its composition.
But like the bioavailability algorithm for calcium, if you know the calcium oxalate and phytate content, you could predict it.
If we knew, yes. So the ingredient line would read, it's a pasta. It would be wheat flour and a few other things, and then bell pepper. So that's, it'd be whole bell pepper, including the stem. But that would be on like the PDP talking about that upcycling might not be reflected in the ingredient line.
Yeah, quick comment to Dr. McBurney and a question for Dr. Professor Harnack. So just to reinforce your point about the need for bioavailability, index for iron, and you can think of some other things. Protein is another one. There's a lot of work going on. The different absorbability of amino acids and conversion to muscle mass of different types of protein, animal source and plant source, is another one. And we're misleading consumers. So the cereal example that was shown in one of the slides, now there's a great movement towards whole grains for important fiber intake reasons. There's a lot of good reasons for that, but that increases the amount of phytic acid, and therefore it's going to increase the already terrible bioavailability of the iron that's commonly used in North America. So it is leading to increased iron deficiency, and that in turn has led to terrible policies all around the world that don't recognize the importance of bioavailability. So I should add a little disclaimer. So I was heavily involved in doing that. Just one point on that iron ETA. It is now the only iron recommended by WHO to fortify whole grain flour. So WHO recognizes it, but most people don't follow that. So that's an important point. Quick question for Dr. Harnack. So your life sounds complicated, and I'm just thinking of how it's going to become more complicated. So you probably know this PTFI project, the periodic, those of us from chemical background, periodic table of food initiative, that is doing a lot of work on mass spec, metabolomic analysis of foods, and they want to do this. Of course, standardization is a problem, but there, of course, when you do those kinds of analysis, you find all kinds of peaks that are unknown, and we now have to figure out those unknown peaks and how we're going to translate those into food. So when we already recognize the deficiencies of traditional analytical chemistry in finding some analyzing the compounds in the food on average, and now it's going to become even more complex with additional aspects. How are you going to deal with that besides retiring?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We keep on tracking. This meeting has been really helpful for me to see where things are headed and what we need to be keeping our eye on. And then we have to prioritize because there's only so much bandwidth we have. And so it's on our radar.
Okay, thank you very much for this session. It was great. It's amazing what you're doing because I think we focus so much on trying to figure out what foods people eat, and we've sort of forgotten that the next part is probably the more complex part that you're tackling. So that's great. I have a simple question. When we access the databases or the algorithm, which depends on the database, is there a column or record when that particular was updated? So if I was a researcher doing it, I often do analytical work. I could actually say, hey, guess what? I have something more recent and maybe I could pass it on.
Yeah, we do keep track of when we update a food product category. We release a new version of the database every year, but not every food is updated every year. We rotate through food product categories. So we do know the date. We also know the source of every nutrient value, so that if you're ever wondering, like, well, where did you come up with that value? We actually have that documented as well in the database.
So Food Data Central at USDA also documents the origin of the values.
So there's a way that, if other people are doing some of the work, they could at least provide it to you, where they may not publish it in their manuscript.
Yes, we welcome that. Just email in our NCC web email and let us know if you've got data to share for anybody who's got data. We do have some, like standards around, we probably would have some questions about how it was chemically analyzed because we only accept values using, sort of accepted analytic methods.
I have two questions for Connie that kind of hit me during your presentation. The first was when you were showing the increased fracture risk in the NHANES data over time. Was that corrected for age?
So there were different age lines, by decade of age.
I didn't catch that, so I missed it. Okay, thanks.
And
also,
it wasn't, it was actual incidence of fractures.
Yeah, when you showed it, it was showing different sites. And so I was asking, given the fact that the population is getting older, could part of that be contributed to the fact that it potentially could be an older population in the different cycles of NHANES?
Let me get back to you on that.
Okay, no problem. The other question with the data that you are showing in terms of the estimates of the bioavailability of calcium in the different countries, taking into account the oxalates and the phytates in the food supply, showing that it's likely to be worse in the African countries. Is there evidence to suggest that they have higher osteoporosis or more bone fractures than other parts of the world?
I don't have data like NHANES. I mean, the estimates for projecting where fractures are going to be is by 2050, half the world's hip fractures are going to be in Asia. Our information in Africa is nearly zero.
And just one thing for the, just in general for the audience here, there was a discussion or a question before about the periodic table of foods initiative and how that's going to play into understanding nutrient composition. And there are plans to link it and for Food Data Central to be the public face for the PTFI initiative. So that'll be linked with other sources of information in USDA.
Yeah, my question is for Lisa, and again, I empathize with the task you have at hand, but with the increase in different culinary approaches in the world, and restaurants are all different, and the chefs are all trying to do different things. How do you, how do you reconcile that with one day? I mean, like a slice of deep dish pizza I saw on your chart. I mean, in Chicago, there's probably 17 different deep dish pizzas, and everyone has their own special crust.
Right, right. Yeah. So, partly, so something, well, there's one thing is our data file, and it has a limited number of, say, varieties of pizza in it. But within our NDSR program, we actually have a variety of how to describe it. I mean, you're asked a series of questions. It sort of builds your pizza on the fly, where you might be asked, is it a thin or thick crust? And what were the toppings? And it's kind of a personalized pizza created for you within the program. So that's a cool part of NDSR. When we license our database, we don't, have all those different variations of a pizza. So it is different pizzas. For different eating traditions, this has been a challenge in that, with different eating traditions, how a Korean dish may be made in the United States is different than how it might be made in Korea, and even here made in different ways. And so to add those foods from different eating traditions, we involve people from those communities to help us choose representative recipes as prepared in the US. And you'll have these variable ingredients of, say, different meats might be used or different combinations of vegetables. But it's never fully representing every possible way someone might prepare the dish.
Do you have any variability measures then around restaurant prepared dishes?
No, we take and we have the chain restaurants in our database. So it's as McDonald's says that their French fry is, we rely on their ingredient statement and their nutrition facts panel information to create our product formulations for, say, the Big Mac. And so if it's not actually prepared that way, it's not like the person actually.
Thanks for a wonderful panel. This is really very exciting work. I just wondered, Connie, and maybe Michael as well. It strikes me that the algorithm that you developed for food would also apply, with some exceptions perhaps, to dietary supplements, where the matrices particularly are important, and wondered what your feelings were about that. I know there's been some work at USDA at Bellsville with herbal supplements with different formulations and matrices, and also with some of the minerals where this becomes important. And all of the pharmacists in the world know about bedpan bullets that are these calcium supplements and other things that elderly people take who don't have any acid left in their stomach, and they end up in the bedpan. So I wondered about the application to dietary supplements.
So I hope that working groups with bioactives do include that, especially. And any of the others. I think iron will get into it, undoubtedly. it's on the radar.
And there's no reason that, in my opinion, any of these nutrients should be different than what's been done with folic acid. I mean, folic acid has a value for supplements, and so we should do food and supplements. I actually think when I do dietary intake, it should always be both. Just looking at only part of the story isn't sufficient.
No, I appreciate the perspectives of all three of you in combination, because when thinking about dietary assessment from the NDS system, as well as going all the way across to think of the bioavailability, it's complex. And making the matter worse is that, it's not just 168 different nutrients, but we didn't even really brush upon the bioactive piece also. I mean, we've been a little heavily focused on micronutrients through no fault of your own. And I guess my question is twofold, especially thinking about the foodome, the periodic table of food, and the dark matter of food and all this also. I think, how can we, because otherwise we're going to be working for the next 150 years, pulling out. I mean, it's not taking anything away from the effort so far, right? But the reality is that if we really want to translate this into meaningful public health messages, can actually change diet and behavior in ways to extend life and quality of life. I think it would make sense for us collectively to think about kind of our top 10 list that we want to start with, rather than having it be like, what are the 10 micronutrients and/or bioactives that we think, at least without even doing the deep dive, have the best preliminary data to suggest that we can link like all the pieces together in a meaningful way. And then, because otherwise I think we're going to find ourselves at a point, it's going to be like an endless death loop, like we see on our computer sometimes, where we're getting someplace, but we're not. So I just want to hear each of your thoughts about that, both from the assessment perspective in terms of dietary assessment, and then going all the way across to thinking about the type of research that we can do in some of the specific components, and how to tie that together, maybe with a faster life cycle to it somehow.
Baby steps. This is a big step forward to add in bioavailability to total.
I think we live in 2025. Change is difficult, and it's time for a redirection in nutrition science. There's so many products, ingredients, products, bioactives, matrices that to try to develop techniques to assess all of those and all of those. We're not that different in our bloodstream or in a biopsy. We may not always want to do that, or a saliva sample or a hair sample. Some of us that will be more difficult than others. But I think we need to transfer to that. We've got the cart before the horse in 2025. We should be assessing people's true status and then going back in the other direction to find out what they've eaten or haven't eaten, and how do we address that. I disagree with the philosophy of throwing more effort into building our databases, developing our analytical technology in foods and supplements, trying to estimate food intake, trying to understand the environmental impact. Work from the other end.
Well, I think databases are ultimately important because people eat food, and we have to come up with recommendations eventually to food. In terms of prioritizing, that is important. That is important. And in our center, we're mostly listening to researchers to hear what they think are the priorities. But there could be ways of consensus could be reached. Maybe USC would be a convener of identifying the top priority bioactives or nutrients, and then getting the funding to chemically analyze enough foods for those compounds that they could be added to a database, for diet assessment.
Clear, please, I don't mean to be misunderstood. I think that food databases are hugely important, and we're always going to need to have estimates of food intake. I just think that we're in a world that we have sort of 80% of our effort focused on that side of the equation. I'm making up these numbers. 20% on actual diagnostic, quick development assessment of true nutritional status. And we should switch that 80-20 around. That's kind of where I'm going.
From a public health perspective, or from the public perspective, these diet tracking apps, it requires people to spend a lot of time tracking, and then how accurate is it versus if there were some low cost, blood tests that could be done to diagnose, so that they know where to focus their energies. And also these diet tracking apps, people are looking day by day, and we know variability, you take it so variable from day to day, it drives me crazy, but just provide them with a 7-day average so a person knows where they sort of generally, what their usual stat intake is.
Yeah, and I'm going to say one more thing. When I was at DSM, I was going to Cornell, and I met a group of scientists that have a device that's as quick as a finger and as cheap as a finger stick for measuring vitamin D, for ferritin, for B12, and can be developed for other vitamins. And so in my dream world, it takes 10 to 15, it's not quite as quick as blood glucose, it's 10 to 15 minutes, but it could be a home use device. It could be in my grocery store pharmacy. And so when I go in, I could go up and have a finger stick done, go and do my shopping, and come back and be told whether I need to have a vitamin D supplement or not. But if we invested in those areas, so in iron, we can already do it. I published a paper that's an assessment of one. And so we can do that. So we can't do it everywhere. I'm not suggesting that we can, but I think we can move a long ways in that direction, and others would move in that direction if they saw the opportunity. They're always going to need to have food, and we're going to need to go back and do some food dietary recall in people of interest.
I might also add in terms of the prioritization, just for transparency's sake. I mean, the committee did, this wasn't a random selection of the nutrients that were chosen, right? I don't think it's really a particularly controversial take to say that nutrients like calcium and iron are incredibly important for the public health. They practically take up rent in the dietary guidelines every 5 years, being nutrients of public health concerns. So, I don't want us to walk away with the idea that we make jokes about how calcium was chosen because it's Connie's favorite, but it was a discussion on what are the ones that A, are public health importance, and B, have data and known inhibitors and enhancers and that sort of thing to make life easier, so we're not digging deep for some obscure nutrients that would confound the process.
So I have a comment on some of the questions that we've had, and also the fact that Connie's map had Zambia very red. And having worked in Zambia for a decade, we had to figure out where the calcium was, because there was no way using US databases that we could come up with the calcium that was actually in the diets. So we looked for it. And so the bottom line is they're eating fish bones, they're eating chicken bones, they're making bone broth soups, they're eating vegetables that are not in food balance sheets because they're all foraged, and the water is rock hard. And so these kinds of things don't come up in databases that we're using. And although the children, their serum calcium wasn't ideal, their parathyroid hormone was fine, and they're not breaking bones, but they're also not living as long. And so that's why we're not seeing the osteoporotic rates that we might see in other countries like Asia and the US. So anyway, there is calcium there, but you got to look for it, and it's not necessarily going to be in the databases that one is going to use.
All right, I think we're going to take one question from our virtual audience because we have a few and we'd like to get to them. So the one we're taking, our first one, so from Esther Myers. So hello, Esther. This one is probably towards for Connie. But when we're looking at nutrient interactions like spinach and calcium, are we still looking at foods individually or mixed or in the eating episodes? For example, if we have spinach quiche that has cheese and spinach, can we assume that the spinach phytic acid also has an impact on bioavailability of the cheese? And how is this addressed at a database level, at a recipe level, but still isn't in an eating episode level? So I know that was a mouthful, so I can break it down a little better.
So we actually did a study where we intrinsically labeled milk and intrinsically labeled spinach and fed them alone and together at the same calcium loads. And there was some exchange so that the mixture was a weighted average of the individuals. So that kind of evidence leads us to believe that you can do a weighted average of a combination in a meal or a food from the individual foods that we can apply that bioavailability algorithm to. So we think it'll work for calcium for all of that. So with the food balance sheets, it's, you know, the net availability of the food basically altogether daily or whatever. And so that's a limitation if really the calcium was consumed remotely in the day from the phytate. Got to start somewhere.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, with that, thank you all very much. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.